Michelle Pentecost is a lecturer in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London. As an anthropologist and physician by training, Michelle Pentecost researches relate to epigenetics, early childhood policies, and pedagogy in the training of health professionals in medical humanities. Her fieldwork takes place in the Global South, in particular in South Africa. She has recently co-authored position papers on social medicine, such as Revitalizing Social Medicine, published in The Lancet in 2021, and we referred already to this paper. So I will not take longer. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Niels. Can I just confirm that you can hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So good afternoon, and thank you so much to the organizers for this invitation. As I'm sure may be the case for many of us on Zoom today, this would have been my first in-person academic conference for quite some time. So I'm very disappointed that I can't be with you in person, but Omicron has upended many of our plans in the last week. Nevertheless, I'm grateful that we have this technology that permits us to gather remotely. And I thank you very much for attending at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. So I've titled this talk, The Future of Social Medicine, as an ironic entry point into what will be less of a discussion of predicted futures and more of a diagnosis of our present. This talk will not offer a programmatic for social medicine, which is all but impossible given the capaciousness of the term and the plural epistemes that fall within social medicine. Rather, I'm going to use this opportunity to reflect on social medicine now and the questions that our present situation bring to the fore for what social medicine is and what it does or might do. Now, the organizers asked us to consider the novel stakes of social medicine. And I will suggest in this talk that how we think about social medicine today must depart from this question: what counts as here? I derive this question from the recently published work of anthropologist James Ferguson. In his essay on the share, Ferguson points out that, quote, "We have spent a lot of critical and political energy rethinking who counts as us. We have recognized that taken for granted social identities are in fact elaborate and consequential constructions whose reworking must be at the heart of our politics." James Ferguson says, "We now need an equal dedication to the problem of what counts as here, recognizing that common sense notions of presence, the idea that some people are here among us while others are not, are also elaborate constructions." Indeed, the very hybrid format of our conference and the delivery of this lecture via remote video link should help us to trouble such distinctions of here and not here. So this is the question that animates this talk, and indeed the future of social medicine. What does it mean to be here? What counts as here? I'm going to approach this question via 3 different angles to help us consider some intersecting areas of concern for social medicine in the 21st century. First, I'm going to offer a genealogy of social medicine from the particular context in which I have come to this work. My commentary today is grounded in a perspective from South Africa, where I'm from, where I trained in clinical medicine and practiced as a medical doctor, and where I've conducted research as an anthropologist for the last decade. As this account will demonstrate, the history of social medicine in South Africa is deeply entwined with and informs histories of social medicine in other parts of the world. So this is the first intervention in the question of here that, as Achille Mbembe will remind us, Africa is part of the world and the world is part of Africa. Second, having myself come to social medicine via training as a physician, I'll consider the question of what counts as here in the place where all of this meets the patient, an important site for thinking about what Ferguson calls presence and obligation. So I'll touch on boundary work in biomedicine and offer some of the thoughts of interdisciplinary communities of practitioners in South Africa who have grappled with some of our key questions today. Finally, I'm going to think about social medicine and what it means to be here as it relates to processes at different scales, drawing on some of the work I've been doing with the Wellcome Trust Global Social Medicine Network, I'll conclude with some thoughts on what I'm calling scalar social medicine and how we might reframe what counts as here for social medicine today. As historians of medicine Anne Lee and Jeremy Green remind us, examining the histories of social medicine is deeply connected to its reconception in the present and its role in the future of medicine and public health. Working with historians has helped me to remember to start from a deeper point of excavation than some of the more immediate histories of social medicine that might come to mind. For an archaeology of social medicine, to start with Foucault is cliched, but perhaps also cliched for a reason. To read him again reminds us that there is a history to the constitution of what we call the social as a site for intervention, and that at least in Europe, that history follows a line from formations of states in the 17th and 18th centuries to emerging concerns about urban health in the late 18th century, to a focus on the health of the labor force in the 19th century, and to the formalization of state health and welfare services in Europe in the mid-20th century. As Vinkem and Gwen has argued, this history of a normative view of the social that configures public health intervention is important, given the persistence of our imagination of the nation state as the entity which defines and bounds a society, an imagination that powerfully configures public health action, as the travel bans that find us sharing remote space make so clear today. As Achille Mbembe has argued, the power of the border lies in its capacity to regulate multiple distributions of populations on the body of the earth, and in so doing, to affect the vital forces of all kinds of beings. For South Africa, the present histories of the state and its position in the current geopolitical order are overlaid with histories of colonization by the Portuguese in the 17th century, the Dutch and English in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, the system of apartheid for the second half of the 20th century, and a combination of neoliberal and welfare models that characterize the state today. And I will spend a bit of time on this history. Histories of social medicine between empire and colony are indelibly linked and co-constitute each other. The post-World War II idea of a national health service, for example, gained currency in both Great Britain and what was then still the Union of South Africa, a self-governing dominion of the British Empire under Jan Smuts at the same time. The establishment of the Gluckman Commission in South Africa to consider the formation and implementation of a national health service that might mirror what was happening in the UK was politically motivated. The promise of benefits for all was potentially a strategy that could overcome deep schisms between pro and anti-British factions of the South African white population. Gluckman and his commissioners had undertaken a 3-month tour of South Africa in preparing a report and found particular inspiration in the work of Doctors Sydney and Emily Koch, who had established a form of what we would now call primary healthcare in the rural area of Phulela in what is now the KwaZulu-Natal province. Phulela is commonly cited as a birthplace of social medicine. Its models of community care were exported to the US, Europe, and Israel by practitioners such as Jack Geiger, who visited Phulela as a junior doctor and then went back to the States, and by South African practitioners who left South Africa following the institution of apartheid legislation in the late 1940s, including John Cassel and Zena Stein, pictured here, as well as the Kochs themselves. So models of social medicine established in parts of rural South Africa would come to shape social medicine programs in the North, a very clear example of the entangled nature of the histories of social medicine. But perhaps more interesting are the less often told stories of exchange between North and South that produced generations of Black African doctors who would come to play important roles in South Africa's political struggles. No universities in South Africa permitted Black students before 1940, hence earlier generations trained overseas, either through private funding or funding from religious organizations. William Anderson Soga, the son of Reverend Theo Soga, pictured here with his wife, Janet Burnside, graduated from Glasgow Medical School in 1883 and is often seen as the first biomedically trained Black doctor in South Africa. Others followed suit, receiving education in Scotland, England, or the US. 29 Black South African doctors qualified from UK or US medical schools, between 1900 and 1940. Among these were Alfred Bettini Xuma, pictured in the middle here, and James Moroka on the bottom, who would both go on to become presidents of the African National Congress in the 1940s. During apartheid, Black South African doctors would continue to play an important role in anti-apartheid struggles, including Steve Biko, who left medical school for full-time politics before his brutal murder by the apartheid state, as well as women, including Mary Malahlela in the top right, and Mampela Rampela, here pictured with Steve Biko. In sum, there is a very different history of social medicine to be told here, but no fewer transnational entanglements that have shaped these histories. And yet the story of medicine in South Africa will often revert to the world's first heart transplant performed by Christian Barnard at Groote Schuur Hospital in 1967 as the emblematic moment of South Africa on the world's biomedical stage, with only belated acknowledgement of the larger teams at work in animal transplantation models that could lead to this scientific feat, such as the contributions of Hamilton Naki, pictured here on the right, in the animal vivisection unit. Groote Schuur to this day is perhaps the most significant tertiary hospital in South Africa in terms of its international standing. And here too, a closer look reveals how healthcare in this place has been undoubtedly shaped by a history of colonialism and racism. The very materiality of this hospital, where I myself underwent my medical training in the early 2000s, reflects this heritage. Groote Schuur Hospital stands at the foot of the Table Mountain Range in Cape Town. The original building was built in the 1930s and then expanded in the 1980s. Since the beginning, the Greek goddess Hygeia has guarded the original hospital entrance, a reminder of the country's imperial past. The second portion of the hospital was built to facilitate racially segregated healthcare, the subject of student protests in the 1980s, as you can see here. If it's a bit small, it says sick architecture, disease design, which has been graffitied by students. As well as fierce public debates in the 1980s, as you can see in this cartoon from 1987, which depicts the white and non-white sections of the hospitals, and a play on the name Groote Schuur, Groote Schuur, meaning the great split. While healthcare in Groote Schuur is no longer segregated, to this day, colonial legacy stares down from the hospital turret in the form of a replica of the bird of Great Zimbabwe. The bird was included in deference to Cecil John Rhodes, the colonist on whose estate the hospital was built. Rhodes had himself acquired the birds of Great Zimbabwe, the ruins of an ancient city of Shona ancestry, following their theft by another European explorer, Willie Posselt, in the 1890s. While the bird remains perched atop Groote Schuur's turret, Rhodes himself has met another end on the University of Cape Town's upper campus, with his statue removed in 2015 following the Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall protests for the decolonization of education in South Africa. While similar calls for Rhodes' removal have reverberated elsewhere, including in the UK, Rhodes remains on his perch at Oriel College in Oxford for now. This is a picture of a protest in 2020. Note the gloved hand of pandemic preparedness of this protester. I now live and work between the UK and South Africa, and this question of what counts as here is very frequently at the front of my mind. There are deep entanglements of the histories of social medicine between South Africa, the UK, US, Israel, and Europe, just as social medicine histories in other parts of the world reference a long history of the movement of people and ideas. For social medicine, the question would appear to be about what was lost in universalizing biologies, bodies, and techniques, and also about what we might gain by departing from the understanding that these sites are entirely co-constituted. How are we taught about what counts as here? In other words, for health practitioners, how are they taught to boundary the social in medical practice? Perhaps the most visual example of this that I can offer is to share a story from fieldwork in Cape Town's clinics where I have been both physician and ethnographer for periods of time. On this occasion, I and some students have joined a radiology round in which a visiting pulmonologist would review interesting or complicated films for the local doctors. The X-ray meeting takes place in a busy emergency department of an overcrowded district hospital. We are all huddled around the wall-mounted computer screen to review this first film, which has everyone puzzled by the white beads scattered across the radiograph. The pulmonologist starts. Buckshot. Buckshot or birdshot are small pellets that have historically been used by police for containing protesters in South Africa. Birdshot will remain under the skin indefinitely. For a brief moment here, biomedicine's borders are perforated. Here is literal evidence of history inscribed in the skin. And yet the group were quite disinterested in this artifact and were eager to focus on the disease in question, tuberculosis, and its hallmarks on this X-ray. During question time, the students were keen to learn about the differential diagnosis, but had no further questions about the white dots that peppered the screen. The boundary work around the social into which healthcare practitioners are socialized in such instances rests on deference to hierarchies of authority, to standing to attention, and to narrowing the gaze. But such boundary work has its price, evident in the low retention of doctors in the public sector in South Africa, the high rates of burnout in healthcare professionals in the country, and the high numbers who leave to practice elsewhere or in another profession entirely. It was these disjunctures between technical care and the prospect of healing that was the impetus for my own trajectory towards a career focused on social medicine. Fortunately, I graduated and worked as a doctor in South Africa at a time of huge revival for interdisciplinary collaboration. The late 2000s and early 2010s were a highly productive and energizing time of positive collaboration between clinicians, social scientists, and historians in South Africa who were working to formalize a medical humanities agenda for the country. Spearheaded by senior colleagues Steve Reed and Susan Levine at the University of Cape Town and Catherine Burns at the University of the Witwatersrand, the move to incorporate social medicine perspectives into health sciences was an exciting period to think about points of intervention for the humanization of medicine in South Africa. At the time of the first Medical Humanities Conference at WITS in 2012, I was a master's student in anthropology and became involved in various social medicine initiatives under the banners of medical humanities, medicine and the arts, critical health social sciences, and transdisciplinary health and development studies. These research programs included several large conferences and resulted in publications that have set a new scene for social medicine in South Africa. My own contributions to this work have been squarely targeted at health sciences education, given my firsthand experience of the inadequacies of a biomedically dominant model of training. Along with colleagues, I've thought about some critical orientations for humanizing health sciences in South Africa. Components of this work speak directly to this question of reframing what counts as here. These come in the form of a critical challenge to North-South knowledge hierarchies in health, a call for health sciences graduates to have a sophisticated understanding of political economy, and a call to embed relatedness in practice. We articulate an expanded definition of structural competency that includes awareness of one's own knowledge and value systems, insight into medicine as its own culture, and an understanding that health and health systems are the product of global histories and interconnected presence. We also articulate the challenges of this kind of work, including the perpetuation of a quants-qual binary that undervalues qualitative work, the need to engage at multiple levels, especially training the trainers, given the centrality of role modeling in the health sciences, the contradictions and tensions of cultivating care as a social ethic in contexts of extreme moral injury for health workers, and the recurring question of language as a barrier to knowledge translation at multiple levels, from the clinical encounter to the publication of research in predominantly Anglophone outlets to meet funder and institutional requirements. In sum, the question of what counts as here is an ongoing intellectual project for social medicine theory with material implications for practice. As South African psychologist Kapano Retele has argued, there are no value-neutral ways of seeing, feeling, or thinking, only the possibility of saying, the world looks like this from here. Let us move now finally to think about social medicine at different scales, or what I'm tentatively calling scalar social medicine. In a time when appeals to the global increasingly no longer hold much sway, perhaps we need what Gabriel Hecht has termed interscalar vehicles to consider how to do social medicine now. As Hecht, an anthropologist working on uranium mining in Gabon, explains, what makes something an interscalar vehicle is not its essence, but its deployment and uptake, its potential to make political claims, craft social relationships, or simply open our imaginations. In thinking about what counts as here, can we reach for a scalar social medicine that foregrounds our interconnection? To return to Lee and Green, social medicine is a field of critical analysis and critical intervention. The first point of reflection, if we are to consider the novel stakes of social medicine, is to consider the current forms of the social that index what counts as here. Just in the last week, these are the headlines that have dominated the news in the UK and in Europe. 1, the death of 31 people trying to cross the English Channel for refuge in the UK, something that Kevin Morrisod was earlier alluding to. And 2, the detection of Omicron by South African scientists, leading to a swift response of selective travel bans by the world that can only be read as a form of veiled racism in terms of its media coverage. Both point to what Des Fitzgerald has recently termed viral nationalism. It is clear that the altruistic or humanitarian logics that might have shaped global public health policy in the first decade of the 21st century have given way, accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, to more explicitly nationalist and market logics, where vertical interventions such as the provision of vaccines are subject to both geopolitics and speculative capitalism, as Vinkem Ngwen and Ryan Whittaker have mentioned today as well. As James Ferguson states, neoliberal government today operates not on a social body, but rather on a network of transacting agents who respond not to obligations, but to incentives. It is in this rather cynical climate in which social medicine initiatives today are tasked. As we face what some might call the end of global health, we have no shortage of examples to draw on in the predictable but unfortunate way in which vaccine distribution for COVID-19 has played out globally to effect what some have called a vaccine apartheid. Indeed, the World Trade Organization meeting that would have taken place in Geneva this week has been cancelled due to travel disruptions, delaying yet again the much needed debate on a TRIPS waiver for vaccine development. Clearly for the WTO, Zoom is not an interscalar vehicle. At the same time, we find ourselves in a moment of intense radicalization of politics that shapes current constraints on our knowledge claims and the possibilities to advocate for the kinds of socio-political values that a social medicine agenda has traditionally held. One potential interscalar vehicle would be the call for social justice, which we've mentioned a few times today already. This is in the title of the landmark special issue for medical humanities in Africa, co-edited by Khaled Samparis, Nolwazi Mkhwanazi, and Victoria Hume in 2018. And indeed, it is in the advertisement for our conference. And it is also something that we talk about in the recent Lancet series that I've co-edited with other members of the Wellcome Trust Global Social Medicine Network, of which many of you are affiliates. However, just as society is predominantly understood as a juridical concept to stand for the state, so too is justice, a term that appeals to the juridical. It is important to remember that the contemporary form of justice so frequently referenced is born out of Western political philosophy that departs from the point of the Western state. It is Anglophone and Francophone in orientation and offers a universalizing vision of liberal theory that has shaped understandings of personhood and responsibilities for at least the last half century. For example, as Malini Rangathan argues in a recent paper on urban planning and forced evictions in Bangalore, the notion of justice derives from a liberal legalism that reroutes the question of land and labor away from legacies of dispossession and back to property rights and ownership, a debate with significant resonance in the South African context. When it comes to the question of what counts as here, we have a panoply of examples of maps redrawn and peoples dispossessed, with little recourse to existing legal frameworks that might facilitate what we think of as justice. This is not to say that the tools of the law are not still some of the best we have at our disposal. Indeed, in South Africa, it is our constitutional democracy and its paper ideals to which we cling to and celebrate. Rather, this is to suggest a considered approach when we make for appeals to social justice in social medicine. In other words, what are the limits of social justice as an interscalar vehicle? As Joshua Franklin, also a physician anthropologist, highlights in recent work on what he calls the mirage and hope of social medicine research, there are limits to the possibilities of medicine for addressing social injustice. For example, citing Elizabeth Pavanelli, he highlights that research that simply supplements medical data with patient narratives as a means of fostering inclusion can itself be read as just another ploy of neoliberal governance. And he warns that research orientated towards solving the problems of social justice without much reflection on its own horizon for action risks simply recycling research incentives without effecting change. As Hannah Kienzler and Barbara Prensak have also recently written, the term solidarity has been similarly overused, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, but without truly meaningful outcomes. In sum, the formalization of social medicine programs and networks across the globe has been a very productive enterprise and has produced a normative body of social medicine theory that includes concepts such as social justice and solidarity in its lexicon. This common language is politically essential, but it behooves us as social medicine practitioners to continually reflect on what happens to these tools and terms when they are reified, formalized, and institutionalized. Another interscalar vehicle might be a biosocial framing for social medicine that recognizes the embodiments of health inequities and considers social medicine within a biosocial turn, understanding health and disease in frameworks of mutual interaction between human and non-human actors and the wider environment. There is at least some backing of attempts to frame what counts as here in the register of the planetary. Ironically, this brings us back to Foucault and his description of what he was thinking of as urban medicine in the 18th century. In his words, not really a medicine of man, the body, and the organism, but a medicine of things, air, water, decompositions, fermentations, a medicine of the living conditions of the existential milieu. So this introduces a question: what would a planetary social medicine look like? And this is something that, of course, Prof. Sen was earlier today alluding to. Perhaps we can define here by what Bruno Latour has called a critical zone, defined by layered dimensions. Could we perhaps start to think social medicine beyond clinics, nation states, and bureaucracies to encompass the breadth of influences on health and disease, from intergeneral traces to the digital worlds that actively shape behavior at scale today? Perhaps social medicine will be most useful if viewing human health through a biosocial lens as the outcome of a complex interrelated system of human impacts on the natural world, human innovations in technology, and the effects of these on human biology. As Latour has also pointed out, the critical zone as an idea also allows us to dispense with older concepts of land, territory, or border. What might borderless social medicine look like? Such a question is, of course, not novel. But what would new models need for a medicine without borders? Here, I'm of course referring to the work of Achille Mbembe, who implores us to turn to world archives for imagining our possible futures. He notes that the Western archive is premised on the crystallization of the idea of a border, and that border is racially encoded. He implores us to draw on the broader archive available to us of a history of movement of people as a social good and of the co-constituted relationships between humans and non-humans. And finally, an understanding that, in his words, community, a word that has also been used today, is unthinkable without some kind of foundational debt, the kind of debt that encompasses not only the living, the now, but also those who have come before and those who will come after, to whom we have obligations. It should not be hard for us to reach for such a vision, given our current crises. How will we respond to this question of what counts as here? This is, to my mind, what defines the novel stakes of social medicine today. Thank you.